Numeracy and literacy as these basic foundational skills, and yet what we know is that employers in the United States are looking for both kind of the interaction or the complementarity between numeracy as a foundational skill and at the same time these what we call soft skills, right? So thinking about like collaboration and teamwork, communication sort of skills, things that people do in the job that don't that allow them to be successful in their work, even though they're not foundational skills. So what do we mean by soft skills? The literature has referred to these as non-cognitive, which I think some people find to be a little derivative. Try to tease apart, the signaling effects that educational credentials provide. Try to tease apart the foundational part, the numeracy, from the soft skill part. What folks are doing in their jobs that allow them to work from day to day. The way we measured these soft skills with the unique PIAAC background questionnaire is that we took the index variables. So there are these index scores that they put together in the full paper. We have the list of items that go into the index scores, but there are 4 of them called influence, planning, task discretion, and readiness to learn. And in the paper, we try to map these to different conversations that go on both in the U.S. and internationally when the OECD and others are putting out these skills reports of what kinds of soft skills are we looking for in the 21st century. And then, of course, we use the numeracy scores. We use 2 different, in this paper, we've used numeracy scores differently. As was mentioned earlier, they're the continuous 500-point score, and then there's also these proficiency cutoff points that have been put out there. Our outcome variable, we coded occupational status based on these 2-digit occupation codes, based on what some sociology folks have done, which is a kind of holistic measure. Often occupational status kind of gets boiled down to how much money you make, and this outcome variable tries to get around that, thinking about the ways that human capital operates through occupations. So I want to just go over the big takeaways quickly, telling you what we found. Our research question, after controlling for foundational skills as measured by the numeracy assessment, are soft skills, the use of soft skills, significantly related to workers' occupational status? And we found, yes, they are. When we entered each of the soft skill index variables into kind of OLS models separately, each of those was positively related. When we added all the 4 soft skills together in a single model, we found that influence was still significant, even after the statistical significance for the other 3 kind of fell away. Just briefly, here's some kind of bivariate statistics or visuals looking at low numeracy versus high numeracy, and the that influence variable that stayed significant, and then also the planning variable. And the reason that we focused on these 2 in this figure is we found that there was an interesting interaction effect. So we took some interaction terms, multiplying the dummy for being high numeracy with the soft skill variable. And what we found is basically that the relationship between numeracy and occupational status does vary according to the use of soft skills. And so relative to high numeracy workers, if low numeracy workers use planning and influence skills more often in their jobs, they tend to have these higher status occupations. And so, again, tying back to this idea that often what policymakers or what folks in the media may focus on is just kind of these basic foundational, do people know math? Do they, the RR? Do you know your R's? We wanted to move a little bit beyond that, and we found some evidence that we need to be thinking in this correlational study, found some evidence that we need to be thinking about, in addition to reading, writing, arithmetic, we need to be thinking about the soft skill element. In further work, we need to be distinguishing between these different soft skill domains. And so I mentioned earlier that we looked at these different reports that, for example, the OECD have put out, where they have broad domains of soft skills, and within those they can suggest many different ways to measure them, which sometimes can sound related and sometimes seem like they're the same thing. And what we need to think about is how to parse those out a little bit more. In ongoing and future work, for example, what we'll present in Toronto in the spring is adding in some educational variables to see, do these findings still hold? We found we already have preliminary findings and show that yes, the use of soft skills is still important, and there is, the relationship does vary between workers without degrees and with degrees. That statistically significant finding was really around task discretion in what we'll be presenting in the future. That's a brief overview of what we found. I'm happy to take any questions when we get to the panel part. Thank you.
We will actually take questions at the end of the all presentations and Randy's discussant remarks. So Leah and Melissa, I don't know who's going to present first.
The context is that we know that WIOA has been supporting adult education, and there's been a lot of focus around in many of your state agencies, and that many state agencies are focusing on low literacy skills as barriers to unemployment, between 8,347 to 6,813, depending on the questions that we looked at, and it included ages 16 to 65. And just to let you know, the oversampling actually did include above that, but according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, about 80% of older adults are out of the labor force. So we didn't think we'd get enough of an insight to really include that in our investigation. We did include young adults 16 to 34, and while many of those individuals could have still been formally in school, according to our investigation, about 1/3 are employed, so we wanted to look at that population in particular. So just so you know that the definition of numeracy for PIAAC is really defined around the ideas and information and how those skills are actually utilized and applied. So that's kind of different than a lot of transition tools that states use that may have different definitions of numeracy and math skills. And so there's a lot of struggle around how to correlate this information about PIAAC into what states are currently using. So we wanted to make sure that we were looking at what is numeracy for this population that was studied, and it basically looked at numeric ability, judgment, and the application of a skill. So our methods and our variables were that we used a series of regression across the 4 categories of employment. So people were either employed, they had no experience with paid work, or there were short-term unemployed, which meant less than a year of having a job, or long-term unemployment, that's more than a year. And we could not look at underemployment, and that was not a focus of our study. We do think that would be something that would be cool if there were some real clear data elements in PIAAC to investigate that. And so we looked at running those initially. The independent and dependent variables and the control variables were separately run for the 6 independent variables that we looked at under basic skills. And now I'm going to let Leah tell you what we found, which is much more exciting than how we found it. And if you have other questions about how we found it, there are lots of information and data tables in our paper.
Thank you, Melissa. So some of our key findings. After all the variables were added into the model, only increases in numeracy skills were protective of the unemployment categories of no experience with paid work and long-term unemployment. So, for example, a 10-point increase on the numeracy assessment, which is approximately 1/5 of a standard deviation, is associated with a 0.2% less likelihood of being unemployed or no experience with paid work, and a 0.1 less likelihood of having long-term unemployment after controlling for the additional variables within the model. No significant relationship was found between any of the information processing skills and short-term unemployment. And this finding seems to indicate how various and disparate factors not captured within the current model impact short-term unemployment. So other variables, for example, short-term health concerns or family obligations, could impact short-term unemployment and are really innumerable. So the study's results point to the centrality of advanced numeracy skills as protective of continued employment, particularly for marginalized groups in the U.S., like women, older adults, and some people of color. So in the numeracy model, including all control variables, a female is 68% more likely than males in the United States to be in the unemployment category of no experience with paid work, and 103% more likely than males to be in the long-term unemployment category. We also found that older people are more at risk for long-term unemployment, to the tune of about 12% more likely. And finally, for Black participants, we found that they are 79% more likely to have no experience with paid work than whites, which was our comparison group. We also found that some numeracy-related everyday life skills, like calculator use, for example, were related to employment status. So what are the implications for policy? Nearly a third of U.S. adults have weak numeracy skills. We know, based on the research of many people that you've heard from already and will hear from later, that there's a strong correlation between numeracy and employability. But particularly, we hope that this study's findings on numeracy as protective of employment are really relevant to programming related to adult education and workforce development. So specifically, the findings on the importance of numeracy as protective against long-term unemployment are really relevant to those interested in programming. To meet the requirements of WIOA and of CCSS, a deep contextual understanding of mathematics in adult education and programming and curricula is required. So we really recommend expanding offerings in numeracy programming and curricula for adult education and workforce development programs. Second, what we found was that additionally, WIOA dictates that certain types and kinds of services for U.S. adult education and workforce development programs, what they can provide. And so based on the delivery of these services, WIOA requires each state to produce statewide performance reports that require disaggregated descriptions of participants as well as their employment barriers. And we found that those reports did not identify low levels of numeracy as one of the barriers to employment. And so we recommend including that as part of the required disaggregation. So this is an example from the employment 2016 statewide performance report for Maryland. And you can see where the arrow is located, they identify low levels of literacy, but we could not find anywhere where low levels of numeracy was also indicated. We also think that that our study has some implications for practice. Particularly, we recommend expanding professional development and training on instructional practices for teaching numeracy skills in adult education and workforce development programs. And then finally, that connecting adult education and workforce development programs with regional workforce agencies is key so that they can better contextualize those skills inside of programming curricula. And that is our contact information. And we would really like to thank AIR and ETS and all of those who helped us to navigate this very complex data set and make this work possible. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Thanks for having me here. What I'm going to talk about today is based on a paper that was released a bit earlier this year. I worked on it with my colleague Mark Fernandez, who's also at Statistics Canada. And so generally looking at whether Canadian jobs are more or less skilled than American jobs. So the background is basically we're thinking about skills, the current debate surrounding skills today, and a lot of it centers on automation and skill changes over time, and what we can expect in terms of skill demands of employers in the future. So we're thinking maybe workers in jobs with higher skill requirements in certain skills, so maybe certain technical skills, as well as skills that are complementary to technology, may be better prepared for these skill changes in the future. Why did we want to compare Canada and the US? Well, we're Statistics Canada. We definitely have to look at Canada. In addition to our geographic proximity, we do have similarities between our labor markets. So we thought, well, maybe workers' occupational skill requirements would also be comparable. But there has been previous work done looking at Canadians and Americans in terms of their educational attainment, literacy, and numeracy. And we find that Canadians generally have higher educational attainment, literacy, and numeracy than Americans. So we thought, well, this might actually have an effect. So what do we want to look at? So our main question is, of course, are the occupational skill level requirements of Canadian jobs higher or lower than that of American jobs? And in particular, are there notable gaps in particular skill areas? We also wanted to look at whether the occupational skill requirements differ among workers who had similar levels of education. And we wanted to know the extent to which workers' characteristics, such as their education, sex, age, literacy, or numeracy skills, accounted for differences in occupational skill levels between American and Canadian jobs. So data, we used the 2012 PIAAC data. We looked obviously at both Canadian and US data, and we focused on paid employees in the prime working age group of 25 to 64. The other thing that we looked at were occupational skill level requirement data from the Occupational Information Network, usually referred to as ONET. And in order to be able to link that data, those data with the PIAAC data, we did have to do some conversion of occupational classifications using concordance files. So in the end, we were able to link occupational skill level data from ONET to the occupations of individuals in the PIAAC data. So we had a wide range of information about their occupational skill requirements. ONET actually has 35 different occupational skill levels that we can look at. It's a wide range of skills, including reading, writing, different social skills, different management skills, complex problem solving. There's a whole range that we're able to look at. The main outcome that I'm going to discuss today is just the percentage differences in occupational skill levels for Canadian and US jobs. And we also ran a decomposition technique, which looked at the skill level gap. So it basically allows us to account for the difference in means between two groups. So we're able to look at the portion of occupational skill gaps explained by different worker characteristics, such as literacy, numeracy, and education. So this is just a general overview of differences by main characteristics by country. One of the more notable things is that among Canadian workers, we have a higher proportion of immigrant workers. Just over 1/4 of our workers are immigrant. A little bit of an explanation in terminology for education. So no post-secondary credential would be basically high school diploma or lower. A non-university post-secondary credential in the US, I believe you tend to refer to them as 2-year degrees or associate's degrees. In Canada, it tends to be more community college diplomas. That is the terminology we tend to use. And also 4-year college, or in Canada, we call them all university degrees. So here we see that in the US, there are a higher proportion of workers with no post-secondary credential. And in Canada, we have a lot of workers, a higher proportion than the US of these non-university post-secondary credentials. In terms of occupational differences over the general occupational groups, there aren't a lot of differences between Canada and the US. The one thing definitely to note is that the US tends to have workers concentrated more in service and sales. occupations, Canadians a little bit more likely to be in technician or associate professional occupations, as well as professionals. So this is just to show the general difference in literacy and numeracy, the mean scores between Canadian and American workers. A lot of the difference is actually concentrated at the lower end of the distribution. So if we look at the 10th percentile for workers in Canada and the US, the difference is much larger among those individuals than if we look at, say, people in the 90th percentile. So this difference is really driven by people in at the lower end of the distribution. So here is, we had to divide the skills up, but here's more technical skills and kind of STEM-related skills. So what we're seeing here is that Canadians generally overall have an advantage among most of the technical skills and also science, mathematics, technology, design skills. So some of the more complementary skills to STEM, we also see an advantage among Canadians, but the gaps are a bit smaller than the technical and STEM skills. And we see not really much difference at all when we look down at social perceptiveness and service orientation. Now, looking at only those workers who have a non-university post-secondary credential, again, we see that Canadians have an advantage in the technical skills and a lot of the STEM-related skills, mathematics, technology, design, for example. And American jobs have a bit of an advantage in science, although it's not a statistically significant difference. Again, we see some gaps in the complementary skills. So management skills, Canadian workers have an advantage over US workers, as well as things like complex problem solving, persuasion. But some of the other social skills, there's not much of a difference. And the US workers have an advantage actually in social perceptiveness and service orientation. Now, looking at university credentials, we see some advantages, again, in the technical skills for Canadian workers, but not so much in other skills related to STEM other than mathematics. And in the complementary skills, we actually see either no real skill gaps between Canadian and US workers, or a lot of towards the bottom, US workers with this type of education actually have an advantage over Canadian workers in terms of things like reading comprehension, management, speaking, critical thinking. Our decomposition results, so generally we were able to explain over 50% of skill gaps in the skill areas where we found statistically significant differences. So we found that educational attainment, literacy, and in particular numeracy skills played very important roles in explaining the gaps between Canada and US jobs. Sociodemographic characteristics explain a very small proportion of the skill gaps. So really it is the education differences, literacy differences, and in particular the numeracy differences really played an important role. So our conclusions, so overall Canadian jobs were more skilled than American jobs, particularly in technical skills, although it is important to note that some of those technical skills are probably susceptible to automation. But among four-year degree holders, Americans held jobs with higher reading, writing, and some social skills compared to Canadian jobs. We did find that higher numeracy skills have led Canadian workers to be more matched with more skilled occupations than their US peers. Literacy and education level also played a role, but to a much smaller extent than numeracy skills. So in the end, taking all of these data together, all these results together, we kind of came to the conclusion that improving numeracy skills may actually increase workers' ability to find higher skilled jobs. So any measures taken to improve numeracy may result in workers being better able to find more highly skilled jobs. And this is my contact information. There's a link to the study, which is probably too lengthy for you to write down. So if you would like me to send it to you, feel free to send me an email. And thank you very much.
Good. So, what does one say about some very interesting, important papers in 7 minutes? And the short answer to that is not much, because I don't have much time, but definitely they deserve much more than what I can say today. I have prepared some individual comments, so just to let you know. But instead, I'd like to provide a little overview of what we mean by the topic of numeracy and how how these papers fit together along those topics. So I'll try to do that. But before embarking on this short overview, I'd like to say a few personal comments, two of them. One is that I had the privilege years ago, can't remember what year it was, I was trying to think about that, to be part of one of the initial meetings for starting to put together PIAAC, and this was at the OECD headquarters in Paris at the Chateau Hall, you know, the very ornate place, and we had, I don't know how many countries, probably about 30-some countries sitting around there. And to be honest, I didn't think this was ever going to be pulled off, especially for the United States. You know, everybody was going in different directions. Small countries were very interested because they didn't have the means to do it themselves. They liked this, you know, kind of company with other countries, but it worked. And I'm so pleased to see that this is now the third session of researchers that have used this, and how researchers have embraced the, you know, the data that has come out of this. So very pleased about that. The second personal comment is that the Upjohn Institute is a research institute, obviously, but it also is the administrative entity for one of the local workforce investment boards. So we have operations and research under one roof. And I just want to say that I think PIAAC has some real potential for on the practical side, and that is that here we have an international baseline, if not a national baseline, for really seeing how our employees, how our workers in our particular area match up with the rest of the country and the rest of the world. Yeah. And I've been told, at least at the first PIAAC meeting you had, that the instrument isn't that expensive, so perhaps it's something that we can use. We haven't done it yet, but there's a promise and potential there that I just wanted to mention. So, the papers. These three papers, of course, focus on numerical skills and how they relate to three aspects of the workplace. We look at soft skills, employment status, and the skill content of jobs, all very important issues. And numeracy is one of the three skill types that are in PIAAC, of course, and we have the other two are literacy, which is our first session today, and then we have problem solving, which I think is in addition to what we've had before. And I was really excited about that problem solving aspect, but we don't touch much on that much in this topic or this session, which is fine. Of course, you know, numeracy is very important, especially when, you know, we hear from all the employers around that, you know, they can't find qualified workers, and at the top of the list of their skills that they're looking for are the STEM skills. And so that's, you know, numeracy is right in the middle of all those, you know, STEM attributes. So that's, you know, very important, and I think what we see in these papers are, you know, represent the importance of that. But before we get too excited about numeracy as the sort of the king or queen of the hill here in terms of the three types of skills, we first need to see how they're related. And the paper I'm going to rely on for that is not one of the three here, but it's a paper that Rick Hanishek wrote about in 2013, which looks like everybody's shaking their heads, they're familiar with it. Three other co-authors that looking at you know, the PIAAC data when it first came out, or thereabouts, and he you know, talks about the correlation between the three different types of skills, and he found that between numeracy and literacy, which are kind of the two top competitors, it was a correlation coefficient of about 0.85, which is pretty high, but not as high as what it was under the International Adult Literacy Survey, which is around 0.9. So we're doing a little better in terms of separating out these skills, but still they're quite high. And then if you go down into numeracy and problem solving and the other two, you know, pairwise correlations, you're into the 0.7 range. So not quite as high as before, but still, you know, we gotta be careful about how we separate out numeracy, literacy, and problem solving. And what he did in his paper was to, he's an economist, like I'm an economist, like there's a few other in the room, right? So we're not alone here today. Reading some of the papers, I felt a little, you know, I don't know, alien to the professions, but I think we'll be fine, don't worry about us. But he looks at wage regressions, and he's looking at how to estimate the skill, returns to skills, as these literacy, numeracy, and problem-solving skill types offer this type of relationship. And so he found that when you put in each one of the individual skills separately, not all together in the equation, but separately, their coefficients were about the same. Okay, high correlation, coefficients about the same, makes a lot of sense. But when you put them in all together, all three of them in the same equation, you find that numeracy comes out on top by a large margin. So, and especially for the U.S. For the pool group, it's not quite as much, but for the U.S. it was quite large. So think of it that way, that numeracy sort of reigns in terms of, you know, who gets to finish at the finish line first, I guess, in terms of the magnitude of these types of skills. So with this perspective or caveat in mind, we have three papers that look at, you know, these different topics that we've just talked about. Let me look at the first paper, talk about the first paper first. And here we look at soft skills. And according to the literature, it appears that soft skills is something that has just been realized, you know, that now soft skills are important. Well, in my 30, 40 years in the workforce area, I think we've always been concerned about soft skills, maybe different types of soft skills. The ones that are included in this paper are what I would say more foundational soft skills than the soft skills of just getting to work on time. And so that might be a kind of intermediate level here between foundational skills that the authors talked about and the soft skills that they're looking at. So that's, you know, sort of one caveat to think about, that perhaps you know, it hasn't been the revelation that you know, the paper might offer, well, in terms of the literature that they cite in that paper. But one thing I wanted to offer is that you know, I got a little confused about all the indexes that were used. Occupational prestige is something that economists kind of shy away from and things like that. So you know, we were a little bit, I was a little bit concerned about how all that might be related. So, you know, one thing that I think is very, let's say, helpful with the PIAAC is that we have a lot of detail here, a lot of richness in the data. And we have, you know, overall in the pooled sample, we have a lot of observations in the U.S., not as much as we perhaps like, but we still have the opportunity to, I think, break apart some of these indexes and see, you know, what's really working within them. So I'd encourage, you know, a little more work in that area, especially for somebody like me who really doesn't know what these indexes are trying to represent, such as occupational prestige and some of the other ones. The second paper looks at whether or not the high numeracy skills protect people who are unemployed. Now, once again, there's another word here that kind of grates with economists, and that is protection. But I think I heard in the presentation words like less likely and things like that, which we're a little more familiar with. And I think to say that it's protected is probably a little bit an overstatement, because remember, we have four different groups of employment here. One is you're employed, another one is you've never worked, okay? You've been always out of the labor force. And so, you know, that's a preference for some people. And so to say that you're protecting, you know, numeracy is protecting them against unemployment, well, they want to be there, okay? There hasn't been a choice. But then you have the others where they have been employed, have been laid off or quit for certain reasons, trying to get back in perhaps. And I think that's where, you know, protection, if you want to use that word, could be much more useful in how to describe that. They use, it's a very complicated model in a sense, because you got four different statuses for employment. So they use a multinomial logistic regression to relate those to the three skill types. And what they basically describe are the odds ratios of what comes out of these estimations, and they're very close to 1. Now, if you know, if you're at 1, it's like being at 0 for marginal effects. And so, but they're all statistically significant except for 1, which you know, means they don't include 1, but in a 95% confidence interval. So they're saying that there is some marginal effects, and when they were describing the effects, they are still quite small, you know, from 0.2% up to maybe, or 0.5% up to maybe 2%. So, you know, we have to think about, you know, what do we mean by protection, and what do we mean by being, they use the terms significant, where I think that means statistically significantly different from 1, okay? So we might want to make sure in the paper that, you know, we're looking at something that is significant in terms of magnitude versus statistically significant, which is, I think, important. Now, the third paper I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm probably getting to the end. The third paper looks at the occupational skill requirements of jobs held by paid employees aged 25 to 64. That's a pretty good age group for the United States. Going back to Hanishek's piece, he finds that wage, if you look at the wage curve, it really peaks at the age 35, okay, and then it starts to plateau and then taper off when you're about 55, in your later years. And so, 25 is a good age to start, and perhaps, we can look at, what is that prime age worker here, which is important, when you look at this, kind of wage curve, just because it's, something you establish at one particular age. It's going to change over the age profile of an individual worker. But the authors then find, based upon this, that the Canadian workers are generally employed in more highly skilled jobs than American counterparts. And of course, much of this is due to the fact that Canada has a larger proportion of their workers who are non-university, that is non-4-year college degree holders. And so among the workers with 4-year university degree, U.S. workers held jobs with higher reading, writing, and social skills than the Canadian counterparts. So it's a very interesting dichotomy between those who don't have the 4-year degrees, and in Canada they're more highly skilled, versus those in the U.S. in which you have people who have attained a college education, that is getting a BA degree or higher, and they're slightly more skilled than the Canadian counterparts. Now, to me, this was a very interesting finding and very intriguing one, because in the U.S. we have this debate going on: is college appropriate or relevant for everyone? Because it seems like we're pushing everybody into college, and so this is showing that perhaps it isn't. We're trying to get more people into the trades and things that might require some post-secondary education, of course, but not a full year or a full 4-year college degree. So I think that offered some insights. But going back to the Hanishek paper that I talked about at the very beginning, it was very interesting because he included not only these numeracy skill types from PIAAC, he also put in the years of schooling for the individuals. And when he did that, the returns to the skill level reduced a lot in the U.S. by 50%. Okay, we had one of the highest in the U.S. We had one of the highest returns to skills in the world, or the 22 countries that were listed in PIAAC, or that he used in PIAAC, and we had a 0.28, okay, which is pretty high. Canada had a 0.197 or 193, sorry, whatever. So pretty close. And so what that means is that when you add schooling, then you've reduced that returns to the skill level down significantly in the U.S. and by a third in Canada, so not quite as much. And the reason for this, he said, is that when you have skills, you then desire to go to school longer, okay? And so perhaps, with that return, people are saying, well, if I go to school a little bit longer, I get a higher return in the U.S. And maybe that's not quite the same. So anyway, something to think about between the relationship between years of schooling and the types of skills that we have included in that paper. All 3 papers were quite interesting. I learned a lot, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to discuss them.